CosmicRadio.TV. Hello and welcome to the fine edition of my so-called 8-Bit Life. I'm your host, Roberto Villegas. Joining me today, game developer Daniel. I was about to say Daniel something, but Daniel Mullins. What am I doing?
Hey.
I'm screwing up names already. How's it going, sir?
Pretty good.
You're lucky. You have like an actually pronounceable name, whereas like I can you never had the sub. Actually, did you ever have a sub script your name back in the day?
Sorry, what?
Like a substitute teacher, or as Mullins, pretty much everyone got it right the first time.
Yeah, I think most people got it right. Yeah.
Well, I should probably at least explain who the hell this guy is and why the hell I'm talking to him. So, as you've all kind of been if you've been keeping up with the podcast as of late, you've been noticing a lot of new faces or a lot of similar faces that are new faces or whatever. So about, I guess it's now 2 months ago. We're now 2 months out, aren't we? Because it was
from South by.
Yeah, we're like 2 months out. Shit.
Yeah, man, that was a while ago.
Wow. Yeah, we're like 2 months out from South by Gaming, and that's where we first met, because I was literally going around the booths finally and doing the usual rounds and everything else like that. And I go to your booth, see like the creator of Pony Island. I go like, oh, I know that game. I've heard that one. And it was like, yeah, I've heard of Pony Island. Like you were surprised that I'd heard about the game, which I'm amazed, because didn't it got some traction before?
Yeah.
I mean, what was it?
I don't want to presume that everyone's heard of it.
Why not? I know, but like, was that your expectation going to South by that everyone's like, oh, what's this game, the Hex?
Yeah, I thought some people would have played Pony Island or would have heard of it. But yeah.
No, it's no worries. But yeah, so we're going around, and so I meet see Daniel here and start chit chatting. Mentioned I knew Pony Island, things like that, and they start going on talking about his, because I looked at there and he has like literally his booth was, I think it was just you. I think it was your laptop or TV screen, and that's about it, which is fine because it doesn't fucking matter. It's a game developer thing. I say that in a bad way because I think ultimately the flashier your booth is, sometimes the worse it is, because you sometimes get like lost in the noise, whereas most people just want to see the game anyways, or want to experience experience the code or talk to the guy. Because we're there, and you start showing me this game that you're working on, the Hex, your new thing, and you already the chat room is killing in saying, whoa, hold up. This is the developer of Pony Island?
Yep.
Yes, it is. Thank you, Arctic Mule, for mentioning the chat room. He was amazed. So we'd had Jonah on earlier this in I think last month. And I'd mentioned, here's the composer for Pony Island. I was like, hold on to your seats. We're going to have somebody coming up again from the team. Lo and behold, it was a developer. Because sorry about that. Because again, we were there, and we start I start talking and chit chatting and kind of going over this. And as you're talking about your new game, not because Pony Island wasn't cool, you start talking about. I guess you should explain what the Hex is, because we're going to jump back a bit. But I feel that you need to talk about this because it was such an interesting way of doing like the murder mystery kind of thing. Yeah.
So the Hex. That's kind of the setup, that it's like a murder mystery, except the murder hasn't happened yet. It's supposed to happen, and you don't know who's planning on committing it. So there's these 6 characters that are trapped together in this old inn, and this inn exists in the space between games. This is a sort of like Wreck-It Ralph universe a little bit. Like the game characters exist outside of their games, and they interact.
Yeah, but unlike Wreck-It Ralph, the inn isn't like Tappers. It's an actual full honest god bar, and you have for lack of better words, like washed up character. Some of the washed up characters from from gaming's past. Which again, I loved that idea of having. First off, I'm a huge fan of like anytime you break the fourth wall. Like that's my favorite, either mechanic in storytelling or mechanic in humor, is just sort of breaking the fourth wall. And
lots of that.
I mean, and you of course you don't shy away from doing that. Point Island was purely, it's one of its main driving points was the idea of sort of breaking.
Maybe even too much.
We'll talk about that in a second. We'll talk about that in terms of past, because I like that idea, especially when it comes to those sort of the gaming. But anyways, continue to talk about the Hex. Sorry about that.
No problem. So there's these 6 characters, and they're like you said, they're kind of washed up video game stereotypes, and they're each from a different video game genre. So when the bartender gets the phone call that someone is planning a murder, that kind of kicks off the story. And the game is split between exploring this old inn in a little bit of a point and click style adventure, a little bit kind of thing, and then at certain parts the characters have memory sections where they play through their past, and each of their pasts is a different game genre, so there's 6 sub games within the main one. And as much as possible I try to intertwine the different genres at times, have common threads, definitely a common story.
I'm only laughing just because, like, I already get that. People are already, some in the chat was asking if there's any nods to Pony Island.
I'm actually, there's a few little ones right now, and but I'm going to have a few like major Easter egg style things that you can find, because I know that a lot of the people who are going to buy this game and play it are going to be people who enjoyed Pony Island. So for sure. Before we start talking about Pony Island and the Hex, we're going to talk. We got to kind of, we here at 8-Bit Life like to build a foundation, like to build a very solid foundation that we build the house on of the conversation before we get to the chimney and everything else like that, and fancy Christmas lights that are going to go around it. So I got to ask, especially when it comes to something, how did you get into game development? Especially that, because there's so many, not just in game development, so many angles, but even in programming, there's so many different angles you could approach. People go from web design to this. Like, what guided you to do games? I think it would be like something psychologically appealing about games in general when I was a kid, because I think to most kids games are very appealing. So I was super into that, and I guess I was creative as a kid, and I was allowed to be creative. So I would like draw stuff, and then I would make little board games and stuff, little figurines out of clay, and make really rudimentary board games. So I guess that started really young, but I guess I started taking it more seriously much later when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do for college/university, and I decided to go into computer science, and that's when the possibility of like doing this as a job like kind of became more real. And then after I got that degree in computer science, I worked in the games industry as a programmer, and then I kind of used that to kind of pay the bills while I made Pony Island, and then that allowed me to now be an indie full time. Yeah,
I think that's one of the things we rarely talk about, especially when it comes to indie programmers, because a lot of people sort of have not the illusion per se, but sort of, we talk about a lot of the hit indie developers from like people, from Phil Fish that made Fez, or Notch, from Mojang and making Minecraft. A lot of these almost as if they came out of nowhere, but that's never the case. A lot of the times they had sort of, cut their teeth in programming someplace else. But you never hear those stories. Like, you never hear the guys that say like, I worked at, 2 to 3 years at Gearbox before I became that. Like one of my friends that's working, I think he's working on a game now, but he's worked on things like, you have to, Super Win the Game. Kyle Pittman, he worked for Gearbox for a couple of years before he started making his own stuff. So, what do you mind saying where you worked at, or do you want to kind of keep that?
Oh no, that's fine. So it's been in Vancouver, and 2 places that no one's heard of, probably. The first one was called Jetpack Interactive, and actually I still am quite close with them because I rent a little desk space in downtown Vancouver from them, so I see them every day now, but I don't work for them anymore.
No, that's usually the case, like, especially when it comes to stuff. You a lot of times, and the reason I'm saying this now because we're already getting some colors to the chat room, they're really good, we're going to get to those. A lot of times, usually, at least I've learned, a lot of indie guys split, with their companies on great terms, because the industry, especially in any city you're in, whether it be Austin, Vancouver, elsewhere in the world, it's all very, very small. Like, you see everybody at the exact same conventions, you see everybody at the same things, and you do not want to have that, like, oh, hey, you don't want to have that on your resume. Because one day, you may come to the point where one of those guys is now a publisher, and now you're looking to get that game published of yours, and they're it's always good to have that contact. So people are kind of asking questions. People, especially in our chat room, sort of asking questions on Pony Island. So let's kind of just jump to that. Now we've kind of at least set this. And I guess this is a good question, and I think this is important as an indie sort of thing. How much has sort of Pony Island success changed you?
Yeah, I see that.
And for those who have no idea, Pony Island is an indie game. We're kind of talking about it much like the Hex is. It's also a metafictional game where a lot of the game's mechanics are sort of screwing with what a game is in terms of, like, for lack of better words, you're hacking, but not quite. It's a little bit more than that, but to kind of give the basic mechanic. The game appears as one thing, but it's not like Frog Fractions where it's this hidden sort of separate concept.
It's very upfront about what it is.
Right.
Much more than Frog Fractions, yeah.
So going into that, because the game, it's funny, that game almost came out of nowhere in a good way. It obviously it didn't come out of nowhere because we'll talk about asking how long it took to develop, because it doesn't just magically appeared.
Yeah, but in terms of marketing and stuff, it's not like I was a big presence on Reddit or on Twitter or anything before it came out. So yeah, I could agree with that.
For sure. So, I guess, has it changed you?
Yeah, I'd say so, for sure. I mean, the biggest change is, of course, with my professional life, because now I'm able to be my own boss and have full creative freedom, and I couldn't imagine what I would want more from a job. So that's pretty awesome. In terms of, like, personally, maybe not as much, but I don't know. Maybe before it came out, it was like a big goal of mine to get to this stage where I was independent and making my own stuff. So that consumed a lot of my thoughts about how I'm going to get that, like what can I do. But then once I achieved that, it maybe freed me up to think about other things. So maybe I've become more thoughtful as a result.
No, that makes sense. I mean, especially when it comes to that, just only because I could. It's weird when I talk to people that have gotten to the point where their game has been published and released and has either been hopefully successfully met, that a lot of times things change in that, cool, now I can work on the next thing and not be afraid I don't make rent, or that I get to eat tomorrow, or all the things that a lot of people don't think about, because to them, like, and I say this in the best possible terms, to a lot of us gamers and a lot of us sort of players of games, or don't see how you got to Pony Island. Like all we see is the final product. We see this game, we see this sort of thing, pseudocode, cool, awesome mechanic, interesting story concept, all these sort of things, humor sort of stuff. We don't see, like, the countless hours that spent coding it, or sort of that. Like, how long was the dev time on Pony Island?
I think it was relatively short. It was over the course of a year, but it was a little bit on and off, because there was a period where I was waiting to hear back from publishers, and I had made a 30-minute demo of the game, but I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to get it on Steam or if I was going to get a publisher. So I kind of stopped during that, because I was like, oh, what's the point if I can't get on Steam? But then there were parts where I was intensely working on it, and also for most of that year I was working full time, and I was trying to squeeze in the Pony Island time outside of work. But then later on I was able to work part time, and that's when I got to buckle down and commit much more time to Pony Island. So maybe if you squished all of it down, it was almost like a 6-month development time, which is quite short.
Wow, that is very short.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, wow. I'm only amazed.
But it's hard to say.
Well, no, because even if, like, 6 months, that's up. Yeah. I mean, especially for that kind of game, only because I can imagine, especially with that, and for those who don't know about the game and are sort of this new to them, for lack of better words, the mechanic of the game, and I say lack of better words because I never know how to explain this sort of stuff, because it's not like, not saying in a bad way, you're not the only one that's ever done, like, the pseudocode thing. I think there's what is it? I think Hack and Slash also has done it before.
Yeah.
A lot of I remember even Exactly. I remember even during the old PS2 days, there's a version of the Matrix game that came out for PS2 that had a pseudo terminal that if you went to and started typing in commands, you can unlock extra features and like cheat codes and stuff like that. And it's sort of a weird pseudo DOS type thing. So it's never, that itself isn't necessarily quite new, but that's still kind of, again, a hard thing to do because you're trying to. Like I'm certain you're not giving everybody like, here you go, enjoy C, or have fun with your C# coding, or time to learn JavaScript. Like, no, that's not what you're doing. You're kind of
no, not at all. Yeah, people I don't think enjoy or come to Pony Island for like an amazing puzzle game. I think that's kind of just taking up. I guess it's part of the pacing in between the weird moments that they really are there for.
No, that makes sense. I mean, especially for that kind of thing, just because. And the only reason I even bring up 6 months is that kind of thing, because I can imagine, even as you're trying to figure things out, you still have to, for the game to work, you almost have to make sort of two games, and that you make the Pony Island base game, which is a certain base sort of mechanic, and you're, a weird neon rainbow pony, unicorn, doing all sorts of crazy things in this island. But at the same time, you then have to go to the, behind the scenes, if you will, and start making another game where that messes up with your primary game. You have to like basically you're making this mechanic built in that fucks with the already existing mechanics.
Yeah, and that's I do that a lot in the Hex too. It can be if the original thing isn't coded cleanly, it can be difficult to go back in and mess with stuff. That varies in difficulty.
So we got another spins one, especially when it comes to, we'll kind of jump to the Hex in a second, just because I'm kind of getting this. But someone's already asking, how did it feel to see huge YouTubers playing your game through and seeing the huge reaction of the game? We're talking about this a little off the air. That I'll tell the story just because it was a funny one. We're kind of talking about sort of followers, and I was giving out the usual links that I typically give to my guests. And he goes, "Yeah, I have a huge following in Germany because like what were you saying that what are the big streamers there?"
A streamer by the name of Gronk did this, and he's like the German PewDiePie, and he has huge.
Does that mean he has an English accent? I'm just fucking with it. I'm just saying that he's a silly little guy. But go on.
Yeah. I mean, and I've had big streamers play the game, but what he did was actually he played the entire game, and then at the end he just put my Twitter page full screen, and he said, "Follow this guy," and everyone's going nuts, and like, oh, and then I luckily tuned into this as it was happening, and I was like, holy shit. So I was like tweeting so that they could see it on stream. I was like, hey, stream, like, and then people in the chat are like, the road to 10K followers. I didn't get there, but I was trying to hype them up, so I was like tweeting,
that's still
the road
cool.
to 10K.
I mean, that's still got to be at least somewhat like somewhat rewarding. Not just because someone's streaming the game. I mean, that's going to happen hopefully, but just the idea that somebody is streaming it, loves it, and then everyone else sort of watching the same thing and sort of, in this collective love cycle of it. Like, I think that's what the coolest part of the indie scene is that a lot of people tend to, when they get it, they really get it. And when they really get it, they love to share it. And because they share it, everyone that's sort of watching that person understands that they get it. That makes any sense?
Yeah, totally.
And that was like, when you told me that, I was like, yep, that makes a whole lot of sense. I guess beyond that, has the feedback been really kind of crazy, especially from not just from streamers, but just even from like reviewers, like were any, or lack of it, even the fans, especially, you go into conventions, imagine you interact with a lot of people. It's like, holy shit.
I really couldn't ask for more. Pretty surreal. It kind of all hits you in a big tidal wave, and then you're kind of just stunned, and after that it all just washes over you. It's weird. Like, it was too much too fast.
It's like, I guess I should ask, only because I'm just very curious, has there ever been because I realize I'm pressed and I'm bringing this up and I shouldn't be doing this way, but it's way more fun. Has there ever been just a hyper bad Steam review or even a press review that just rubbed you completely the wrong way? I mean, for the most part, everyone's been happy, and this is not me trying to stoke any waters.
Oh yeah.
I'm only curious, especially when it comes to that kind of thing.
Well, it's interesting because I think since the initial reaction to Pony Island was so positive, and it's got like really like the vast majority of ratings on Steam are positive, it kind of makes me feel impenetrable when it comes to negative feedback. Like when like, oh yeah, you don't like it? Well, guess what? All these people do. So
you know what? That's a damn good approach to take it, especially that way, because I would not think of just like the whole like I'm Teflon kind of thing, because that makes.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, that doesn't transfer over to your other stuff. So when I'm working on the hex and I don't have the validation yet, and I'm totally sensitive about the hex, and before I actually went to South by, I wanted to test my demo because I wanted to get it a good demo because I had specially made it for South by, and I put it on this user testing service where it's not really for games, but I was trying it out, and people film themselves playing your game and they give you feedback, and they are meant to be critical, but I just wanted to find bugs and stuff, but this guy ripped it apart. And devastating. It hurt so much, and I thought that I was impenetrable because whenever I see criticism for Pony Island, I'm like, yeah, whatever. But because I don't have that for the hex, and I'm not as sure of it yet, it was devastating.
Well, you're just starting out with that one, especially that game, just because it is such a new thing and a new concept. Even though, yes, we've done the sort of like, meeting grounds for game characters, especially I think the inventory was done by the Telltale Games guys, where it's like the Heavy and Sam from Sam Max, and a lot of these like, and Gladys is like dealing out poker cards, and I think the second version. So it's not like that's a new sort of thing, but it is a new game to you, and sort of you haven't had that sort of same The joke is it good? Is this the only game he makes? It's, I'm saying that, not saying that it isn't, because I actually kind of enjoyed it and stuff like that. But people are we're already getting another question. I think this actually leads also into an interesting topic too, especially when it comes to game developers and that we talked about how you got into programming and things like that. But like, what was the game that inspired you to kind of do it even more? Like, was there a specific game that got you? I mean, was there a specific game that you watched?
Me to make games? I don't know. I wouldn't say there was a specific game that made me more want to make them. Just like I was playing them over time as that interest was building. But I think that making games in a game jam setting was an activity that made me much more confident and realize what I wanted to do.
Well, like a game jam, like that to me, I think is one of the more interesting things of kind of our modern development indie culture. Just the idea of saying, all right, you have 24 hours, make something. Because a lot of people, and for those who've never participated in one of these or ever heard of them, basically a game jam, for lack of better words, is almost like the Iron Chef of gaming. Where you basically say, all right, your special ingredient, first person, but it must be about aliens and monkeys, go. And like that's where it begins, and those are the ingredients, and it's like, fuck, now I gotta make a game, and not just make a game, but like make an engine, make art assets, make music, make all the components that we know as a game, and still make it. So what happens is, especially, and I can imagine this is what happened to you, is you basically take a concept and boil it down to its most concentrated, quickest form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pretty much. And it's you don't even always have a concept at the beginning. It's just you have to start now. So you start without even knowing what the game is going to be. Just start drawing something, and it's like, I guess because of how I drew this, now I'm making a platformer or something. You can't spend too much time planning, or at least I don't.
Well, no, you can't. No, you're absolutely right. Especially it's like the clock is ticking. Even though it might be 24 hours, it's still the clock is ticking, and you have to make something that's playable. It doesn't have to be necessarily mind blowing or crazy or anything, or awe-inspiring. Like, you're not making you don't have to make like Life is Strange or Stanley Parable, but it's got to be more than tic-tac-toe. That's the hope and dream. Because
for a lot of people, it's their first time making a game, and tic-tac-toe is perfectly acceptable.
That's for sure. I mean, again, even if it's not your first time, I know like one of the conventions I go to here in Austin a lot, called Fantastic Arcade, They typically have a game jam based around the festival itself and sort of kind of silly sort of themes, and they're always funny kind of stuff. And usually, all those games are then part of like a final competition for just people playing that had competed against the games and whatnot. So it becomes sort of a fun sort of event of like play all the game jam games, and they're all either silly over the top stuff or that.
Cool.
And, the themes are always sort of ridiculous because it's originally was part of a genre film festival, so it became part of like genre gaming and things like that. So it's always kind of fun. But I always find those so damn fascinating, just because we talk about game development. We talked about this in the past, but it's always about iteration. It's always about this, trying to get to a point, and usually that iteration goes over a couple of years or a couple of months in your case, something like that. But to condense that to like hours, where it's like, okay, this isn't working, scrap it. This isn't working, scrap it. This is kind of working, cool. Let's build off this, and just to get there at like a breakneck pace, like that just that both inspires me and scares me, because that's like that to me sounds like it's got to be just nerve wracking.
Yeah, I usually on the last day of Ludum Dare is 48 hours, so it's for me in my time zone it's like Friday night and Saturday and Sunday, and usually when it gets to Sunday I wake up and I just like sit down and my adrenaline is going the entire time trying to get to what I was trying
to get trying to get to the proverbial finish line, to get squash as many bugs as you can, hoping no one finds that one bug you just couldn't get working, because it's like, I gotta get this done. and turn it in, because it's like finals week all over again, and I always find it exciting just because it's either one guy or it's two guys, or maybe it's like let's just do this. Like, I know how to make music, I know how to program, I think I can draw. Cool, let's do a game jam. We could do this. And then 48 hours later, you're just you're choking each other's necks, and everyone's at like a weird gunpoint. Like, it's become this like almost a battle zone, and you're just looking at each other like, what did we do? As you stare at your Unity code, hoping it works.
I did the global game jam this year, and I did it in a big team, which I've never done before. We had 10 people, and it was way too many people, but the group dynamic there was interesting. There was a lot of tension, like you're saying, like people at gunpoint. Well,
just because, again, if you think about it, and especially when it comes to this, like there's got to have been points in Pony Island. I mean, thankfully you're kind of your own, and so you can kind of make that call. But I can imagine there's sometimes a point of a in that game development that there was something you were super close to that you just couldn't let go. And that happens to everybody in any creative project. But I can imagine with 10 people that there's going to be 10 separate things. And not all those 10 separate things are going to work together, just because you all have sort of, you may have like a mission and plan saying like, okay, well, we got to kind of go within the theme. But someone's like, yeah, but I really, really want to make that JRPG, thing I've always wanted to dream. I really want to, do this as that. It's like, well, I want to make an homage to, Blade Runner. And it's like, how are we going to do this in like 48 hours? Because we gotta get moving if we're going to do this right. And, a 10 people team can just.
And in the end, it was just like the people who were the programmers got to make the decisions, because they're the one typing the stuff in.
Yep.
At the very end, there's like a minor dispute I remember at the very end, and like the person sitting at the keyboard was the one who made the decision.
Because he had to make a call, because a call had to be made. Somebody had to make that hard decision, because the clock was ticking. That's what I always liked about that, is that because it becomes this. It basically, and if you've ever, this is my opinion, and you can say I'm right or wrong, and I'm a bit curious if I'm wrong, and then why. But I've always viewed like that kind of game jam as preparing you for working in a modern team, for AAA or for anything, especially because somebody's got to make those tough calls of like, this isn't working, this we can't get this code to work, or it's just not fun, and you've got to cut that code because you eventually got to ship this thing,
Mm-hmm. It's like the whole process just condensed down to a few days.
That's again, it's so much fun. So let's kind of jump into the hex now, since we're kind of getting and talking more about this stuff. And you brought up earlier that it was doing the whole kind of metaphysical thing and metafictional thing again, sort of having this sort of play on stuff. And even in the slice you showed there at South by Gaming, it was of sort of this platformer character, like almost like the washed up version of Sonic, or some people might say the real version of Sonic, depending on where you fall on things. And we'll just leave it at that, just for I don't want to make today like let's disc Sega. Like I don't want to make that the mission today's show. But I guess I gotta ask, why approach metafiction again, especially since Pony Island was such a high success at that. Not
and
because
that wasn't even like the intention at the very beginning, because I think I might have mentioned that the initial inspiration for the game was the movie The Hateful Eight. That was Tarantino's last movie, and I just really liked, I guess, the premise of like these kind of like badass, shifty, mysterious characters shoved together in a confined space, and like the shifting power dynamics and trying to piece together what's going on and what happened. So I was just thinking about how I could make that into a game. And then I thought, well, because it's a game that I'm making, then it would make sense maybe if these characters were video game characters. And then it's that like metafictional stuff slowly crept in, and now it's a major feature, I guess.
No, that's that again, showing for the, how an idea can evolve into what it is now, especially with game development. This was in any creative work. We always say that the creative process is all about iteration, and sometimes the original idea might be this, but as things start creeping in, the whole project scope changes and stuff like that. Like, when did it start becoming the concept of when other video game characters started coming in? Is that when the idea of making, for lack of better words, multiple games in one started creeping in as well?
Yeah, I think so. And that was before I really started, because it was just the train of thought was, okay, The Hateful Eight, and then, oh, what if they were video game characters? And then before I even started, it was, yeah, that'd be cool if I had those memory sections. They were originally going to be a more minor part of the game, but then as I was developing it, it made more sense that they were actually most of the playtime in the game is not the exploring of the inn. I'd say that's maybe a quarter of it, but I'm not done the game yet, so we'll see. But
no, yeah. For sure. I mean, especially that. So I guess
so. The idea was always there.
That does lead into a thing, and I brought this up at South by when it started kicking me, when it started clicking in, and I don't know if anyone else has asked you this, so I'm going to ask on the air anyways. Again, is it a bit crazy to just basically make multiple games into one? Isn't it? Not saying it's not ambitious, because this is for those who have no idea what I'm talking about. Sort of the hex, as you pitched it to me then, and you started pitching now, is these characters meeting in, sort of thing like that. But each one of these characters is sort of, talking to the bartender, sort of saying like, "What's your story?" Like, let me tell you my story, bub. And all of them are different archetypes of characters: a platformer character, a marine-esque character, and they all had their title game, sort of thing. Or title franchise.
Yeah, exactly.
But each one of them were different. As you tell me, like, but each one is different game genres. And my brain goes, hold on a second. Are you basically making like 4 different game engines in one? And you're like, yeah, I guess. I go, that's a bit ambitious.
Yeah.
For a second game.
Coming from the game jam mentality, at the beginning, it was like, oh yeah, well, I've made a platformer in a weekend, I've made a shooter in a weekend, so of course I can do this. And I mean, that has been true to some degree. I mean, I will finish the game, and most likely I'll finish it this year. It's taking a little longer than I initially planned, but it's by no means unattainable. No, and that wasn't what wasn't wasn't the intent. Of course, it's obtainable, and anything is, you give it time. It's the idea of like, we talk about a lot of times when I talk about developers, we talk about the concept of scope, and if you ever want to have fun, flip open your any Game of Sutra thread, and you'll find the guy coming in and say like, I got this great idea for an amazing MMO, and it's like, hold on there a second, let's rewind a bit. Have you thought about databases yet? Data what? And and it's the only reason I brought it up is just the idea of like, man, that is. I mean, it sounds cool. This is not me saying it doesn't sound cool. A lot of cool ideas are great. Now, I always want the more power to rock and roll, but it's like, man, that's really ambitious to do that, especially just because. And this is what I said then, and sort of we start talking then, and a little bit now, is even though these are like small little slices, you're still having to make all the rules of those games. Mm-hmm. And that part is done at this point. Like the systems for each of the 6 games have been done for a while, and especially I'm basically there's 6 characters, right? So there's 6 chapters, and 3 of them are in a state of being done or like very close to done. The fourth one I'm about halfway through right now, and then for 5 and 6 I have only like the bare bones of them. But the middle two, which is the JRPG and the tactics game, the turn-based tactics, those are both pretty systems intensive, and those systems are basically done at this point. So that, I guess those difficulties are behind me now.
That makes sense. That's good.
Yeah.
Only because like that was I always thought that was the coolest thing that this game had the potential or has the potential for, is just the idea of having these sort of things. And I guess you can like talk about some of the characters. So you have, let's see, you had like sort of like we said earlier, like a washed up platformer.
Yeah. So there's Super Weasel Kid, and he is like kind of like a child star. His game Super Weasel Kid was hugely popular and rocketed him to like superstar status. And then the sequel was less well received as he reached his teenage years, and it was trying a little too hard to be cool,
to be edgy.
It was rock and roll, and but some people still liked it. They added combat to it. What were they thinking? And then in the third one, they try to remake and recapture the first one, and it's a total failure. And like there's bugs everywhere. And then that's kind of the end of his little section. He kind of like falls from grace.
Do you ever feel that like only as an indie guy, like do you feel like you sometimes get a little too close to the mark? I mean, a little like especially when it comes. I mean, yes, we can make the parody of Weasel Kid, but it's like that is such
a little too close to Sonic. You mean? Yeah.
A little, just a tad, just not the Sonic team. They're working on Sonic. Was it Sonic Mania, Sonic Mayhem, Sonic? We can now make a 16-bit game in Unity and still make it great.
I think the ideas sometimes are a little derivative, like what I've just said. Yeah, that sounds a lot like Sonic, but when it's implemented, it ends up just through the process of being made, distorting in weird ways, so that when you actually play it through, you don't really think like, oh, that was Sonic.
Well,
like,
that's
it has elements of that, right. but in the end, a really basic idea can get weird when it's made.
Well, because like the version you showed at South by, the demo was basically was Weasel Kid. And what I loved about it, and I sort of noticed when someone was playing, because I was just chit-chatting with you, I didn't really want to play games, just like, let me ask the developer questions and do the networking thing. I saw someone playing it, and as they're playing it, Steam looking comments came up, and it's just like, and that became part of the level as he was hopping around, because you're not playing the game per se, you're playing the memory of this character.
Exactly. And that was each of those memories has an element of a sort of meta element that peeks through. So for Weasel Kid, reviews are the thing that you see that kind of tell a story as you're playing.
And that to me seems like out of all the stuff that's going to be an interesting storytelling beat, especially the idea of having these characters be washed up and be like that they're not in their heyday anymore, and they're sort of like looking back at the glory days or not glory days, and I like the idea of having those characters interact, because you were talking about like as a future idea of having sometimes the characters cross between each one of the worlds.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of that in there right now, or actually a good amount of that. Yeah.
The idea of like you'd have like the JRPG character, and I'm just making things up, not saying that these are the characters in there or not, just to for that thing, but have the JRPG character appear in Weasel Kid, and the Marine character appear somewhere else, and
very much happens. Yeah.
Right. This is what you told me, and this I'm trying to hold back things from like I don't want to ever spoil anything ahead of time, but I like that idea about that, especially just having these characters, like much like the Hateful Eight sort of thing. That makes a whole lot of sense, because if you think about them as these are the worlds they exist in, and another hero's kind of coming in to sort of assist or join the party, they would play by their own rules and their own mechanics. That's or they'd kind of play by sort of a mixture of the two, because they know how that works, and it's just there's a little bit of there's an interesting part of magic in there just by having these characters also self-aware that they're video game characters, because they can kind of have those sort of fun with things like that. I guess I should ask, especially because we're kind of getting to the end of the hour here, like where does it all end? Like when it came to developing this and sort of making your game characters and sort of figuring out, were there any concepts that have already been slashed just because you're looking at when you want to release this?
Yeah, well, there was one big decision I made that I'm so glad I did, because it it was making me anxious, and it was making me think this game was going to take forever. And the initial plan was that you could play through the characters in any order, and you could switch between them at will when you're in the inn together. And because you could play them in any order, things would happen differently depending on the order that you chose. And that was just such a scope creep, and was going to be so much work. And actually, I think it might even benefit the product in the end that that you play through them in a fixed order, because I think I can make the story a lot more coherent that way.
I think so too. I mean, especially because like when it comes to multi-character narratives, and a lot of people don't quite study a game like this, but if you think of it like a movie. There's a movie back in the 90s called, I think Go is the name of the movie, where basically you have like three characters kind of telling the same story, and they pass the story along the three characters, and they all kind of meet up at the end. And that's a very, very common technique in storytelling when you have a story, a story told from multiple angles, because everyone has sort of a different view of how the story went, and none of the characters are wrong. It's just that's how they viewed their story. And I think that especially when it comes to this, even though they're all separate games, they all have their arcs and why they did the things they do, and why things are happening the way they are. And I think that it would have been actually, in my opinion too, it would have weakened the story, just because you now have the ability to say, well, let's open up with this, this character's arc and beat, have this other character walk in and say, well, oh, that's your problem, let me tell you my problems, and sort of have that pass along. God, I'm excited for this game as much as I was then, because it's
no, thank you.
Well, because I keep saying it, but it hits me in certain ways, but more so it does seem kind of ambitious to do multiple games in one, but not because they're multiple games, but just because you have to. Like, you have to sort of, you can't just say like, well, here's a fighting game character, I want to put him in platformer. It just doesn't work that way. You have to sort of, figure out what that game, even if it's a simple, version of that game, you still have to make the rules of that kind of game thing.
And I did definitely simplify things, definitely for the sake of the game, not for my own sake, because if you're only like, these little vignettes of their memories are at most 30 minutes each. So I don't want to have you go deep into a complicated RPG system for just 30 minutes and then forget it all. That's really bizarre, even if it does emerge in a few spots later. So I tried to get the essence of these genres, but not go deep. Too deep into
and I think that's the cool part of it, and that's sort of, as you mentioned, that is the game jam concept, the idea of like boiling down this game to its pure essence, and again, as a story mechanic, that's a very interesting way of commenting on games, because like we have you have sort of Pony Island, that's sort of a commentary on games a certain way. You have things like Stanley Parable, which is super commentary on game development, even game audiences at times, like that, like one of my favorite and you have things like Undertale that sort of comments on that. Even something as a AAA game like BioShock talks about agency in a video game, things like that. And I love, again, like that idea of using, here is a very common storytelling technique in movies and television and in books and everything else. Let's apply that same logic to games, and how would that sort of look? Because again, you said like, I watched Hateful Eight, and I love, it's one of the last Tarantino flick I watched, and I like that story mechanic. What if we applied that to video games and did that, and how would that emerge? And then that becomes what the Hex looks like, and I like that idea. That sort of
I tried that a lot with movies or concepts, like how could this be a game, and it usually is difficult, and I never come up with anything, because it's so hard a lot of the time because games are so limited in a lot of ways. Like, if you wanted to make a game that involved like a conversation with a person, and you wanted this is a game about conversation, well, you can't even do that, like in a single player game, at least. Like, it's just, we just can't simulate a conversation.
And this is where we start, one of the concepts in gaming is, and this is something that I'm cool with and I understand, because usually my criteria for like a story-based game is, if you made me care about the weird pixels on screen, you've achieved the goal, and you've got me as an audience person, because ultimately, if you made me care about this little avatar on the screen, this meat boy, this weird guy with the fez on there with everything else, if you got me to that point congratulations, you've won. But we talk about sort of gaming and the idea, but like especially when we talk about like the current concept in gaming is like, everyone makes a choice. You get to make these sort of things. But if again all this is programmed, so you can you could theoretically program infinite choices.
Yeah.
But you would take infinite time.
Yeah.
Right. And it would take infinite space. And eventually you have, like we were talking about before during game jams, during anything, eventually you have to ship this thing. Eventually it has to come out, because if it doesn't come out, then you don't get paid. And if you don't get paid, then you don't eat. And then everything, everything piles up, because that's just the nature of things. And whether you like it or not, that's just how it is. Yeah. And so whenever those things come up, it's always fun to talk about the idea of, how do you make the illusion of choice, to a game player, and how you, even if I see the seams of a game of like, oh, I can see where they're doing, that doesn't mean it's not enjoyable. Like I could see where, Life is Strange, and, ultimately that game boiled down to two choices. But it sort of made it and sort of like why it boiled down. Even something like, BioShock Infinite boiled down to the choices really didn't matter, but that didn't, that. But even the idea of giving the illusion that I had some sort of agency and control over this pre-programmed thing.
And I think that happened with Pony Island and the Hex, maybe not even intentionally, but it's something a lot of things I don't do intentionally, but then I notice about my own work. And like for those two games, there are no like decisions really you make. You cannot affect the outcome of either of these games. I mean, there's little bonus Easter egg endings in Pony Island, and I'll probably do the same for the Hex, but those aren't really like canon. Like there's no branching paths of narratives in these games. What I've tried to do though is when the story is happening to you, you have kind of room to wiggle around, I guess I'd put it that way. Like in Pony Island, like a lot of the story or exposition is through the Hopeless Soul character who's talking to you with chat, and what you say barely affects what he says to you, but you still are typing in words. So you're kind of like, you have some wiggle room, and you still feel like you have agency, even though the outcome is very fixed. So that's my strategy.
No, and that's not even a bad strategy, because again, it's hard. It's not that it's difficult. It's not that you can't do it. Like you can, again, like we're saying before, you can program an infinite thing, but then you've got, you still have to make sacrifices. Even something like, Fallout 4, even this open world game, you still have this linear story. That's the main kind of branch, storyline. You can kind of choose how you attack it, but it's going to end one of so many ways because you have voice actors. And if you didn't have voice actors, well, maybe you could change it differently because you have text. But then that becomes.
But even then, someone has to write the text. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Somebody has to write the script. Somebody has to do all these sort of things. At some point, something has to be made, because we're not at the point where you have AI doing this. We don't have the point where we have an infinite amount of processing power to do this. We're not in the metaverse quite yet. But that's what, again, for me, it's always that, how do you achieve the illusion of that? How do you make it so that a player either doesn't realize it, or if they do realize it, like myself, I still don't mind, because I'm enjoying I'm along for the ride. I remember when Undertale kind of did its twists and turns, I was like, that's kind of cool. I wasn't expecting that. Or even in like BioShock, the first one, I wasn't expecting how it would handle the idea of agency and not agency in a game, and how it would sort of do this sort of thing of like, oh shit, you totally completely subverted things. And even in Pony Island, the idea of like, well, here's this game, because I think it was we were talking with Jonah earlier, and I forgot what song it was he had, but there's a moment in the game where it's like there's the right way of doing it, in that you hack the game to kind of skip shit around, but if you do it 100 times, it's the in-game way, and he wasn't expecting anyone to do it 100 times, and even he was as a game developer was like, well, fuck, someone did it 100 times. Shit, well, I gotta code something. When I found out someone
did that 100 times, I had to put in something for them. I felt like morally obliged, because like, oh my god, like that poor person, like that must have taken like 3 hours.
And the thing is, you didn't even know that as a developer, in that you programmed it that way of like, no one's gonna fucking do this 100 times. I'm gonna put this the joke in because that's the gag, because that's the story beat I want to hit. And yet, because you gave the player a choice, you're like, well, fuck that, I'm gonna do it. Like even something like Stanley Parable, where it's like Stanley moved to the right and people go to the left. The developer's like, I coded what happens when they go to the left. There's only so many paths you can go in that game. And that's just the nature of things. It's just there's nothing, you can only take so much data in. You can only say like, well, because at a certain point it becomes this crazy thing of like, well, no one's ever going to see it, like who's going to play the game on December 9th at 12 p.m. While the moon's in a certain phase at this certain year, just to trigger this one little event.
The nice thing about that though is if you do have enough of those little like weird rare occurrences, if you have enough of them, people don't have to find all of them, but if they find one, that's very exciting.
That's true.
That's my approach to Easter eggs. Like, sprinkle them around, make them very difficult, and I don't expect anyone to find all of them on their own. But just finding one opens your mind to the idea, like, oh wow, maybe this stuff is everywhere.
Holy shit, there's more. Yeah. Especially those ones. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense because there's a lot of those Easter eggs that I'll read up on. It's like, oh damn, I don't have any time to do this, and I don't want to hack my clock right now. Let me go look what this looks like on YouTube. Yeah. Daniel, we are at the hour mark, but dude, thank you so much for being on.
That was great.
I guess, for people who are just, watching this later on, especially who are fans of yours or not fans of yours, and they've heard all this stuff, how can they first off follow you? How can they get a hold of Pony Island? And more importantly, how can they keep track of the hex? Because I think everyone want to know that one.
Well, probably it would be Twitter. And that would be my handle at DMullinsGames. And I post GIFs of the hex every once in a while, and I'll absolutely be tweeting when it comes out. As for Pony Island, just Google Pony Island.
Yeah, because it's everywhere.
And you'll probably find that. Well, I mean, like Google Steam any game.
That's true. It's on Steam, and the hex is going to be on Steam. I think there's already there's already a page for it on Steam as well.
Yeah, there's a page for it.
So you can add, so if you're a Steam user, add it to your wish list. It'll tell you when it comes out. You'll be ready to buy it, be ready to support it, and play the game. Of course, you can do the same with me. I'm at Vincent404 there on Twitters. If you want to catch previous episodes of this podcast, you can go to our website, CosmicRadio.TV /8BitLife. There, find links to show notes, our Twitter account as well for the show, which is at 8BitLife Podcast. And of course, if you're typically watching this show, we typically stream on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Central. Today we're doing it on Thursdays, but you can catch all that at twitch.tv /CosmicRadio.TV. Just hit that big old follow, subscribe, whatever button it is. I think it's follow right now. Hit that. It'll tell you whenever we go live for whatever things. And of course, after you've bought all the amazing games from Daniel here, and you've pre-ordered all the stuff you need to pre-order, and you have like $1.50 and change, head over to patreon.com /8BitLife and help this podcast become bigger, better, and more awesomer. So that is it for today. So tune next time, talking another something completely and utterly random. Bye, people.